We'd like to now move on to our next session for the day, titled Making Hybrid Work Work. As leaders and workforce recognize what is possible in the hybrid era of working, they are embracing this chapter to reset work like never before. While the transition is not easy as it may sound, there is the need to make hybrid work work. I'd like to invite our speakers for this session, Harita Gupta, Senior Vice President, Head APAC and Global Head Enterprise Service, Sutherland, and Ratnam Krishnan, Co-CEO, Barclays Global Service Center India, to please come up on stage. And moderating this session is Nitin Chandalia, Managing Director and Partner at BCG. A very brief introduction. Nitin Chandalia works with technology and media clients on topics including growth, go-to-market, delivery cost transformation, and organizational redesign. Recently, like I mentioned, he has led several large transformation programs to drive revenue acceleration and margin improvement. Over to you, Nitin.
Sure. Thank you. This time I made sure I had the mic up. I don't like to speak on that one, but thank you everyone for the participation so far. You've been a great set of listeners and audience over the last hour and a half. What we'll try and do in this session, we'll try and make it as interactive as possible. It's not going to be one way. There are a set of questions around which we're going to structure the discussion, but we'll keep enough time for questions that you may have in the audience to be thrown at us, all kinds of curveballs and googlies, and everything is allowed, and we will see how we best address that. That will hopefully make this more interesting. So with that, thank you everyone. As we've heard from Sangeeta, Dr. Mittal, then I talked to you about the report. There are many open questions as we think about the future of work or the hybrid operating model. And we thought we will have leaders who are actually practicing this and seeing this in their organizations on a day-to-day basis. I'm glad we have Harita and Uma, who have several years of experience, have been through this in the last 24 months, have seen how this whole thing has evolved, both from a service provider perspective as well as from a GCC perspective. I think there are different elements that we'll be able to bring out. So with that, if I could start with the first question, and which is going to be slightly broader to you, Harita. What's really been the top 2 learnings in this transition over the last 24 months? If you were to think of, there are many things that we've gone through, but top 2 revelations, learnings from your perspective.
So, Nitin, you're right. I've been in the industry for a long time and gone through a lot of change. And, change management was always the buzzword, saying, how do you get change management right? But I think my top 2 learnings in the last 2 to 3 years, number 1 is that people focus never goes away. And if you look at whatever decision you make as a leader, with people at the heart and the center, I think you get it right. And the second learning, and having worked for Microsoft in my past, was what Satya once said from a book by Carol Dweck, which talked about growth mindset. And, at that time, I couldn't relate to it. But today, every morning when I think about it, and that's the culture that we're sort of bringing about in our leadership in our company, that how do you every day live and believe the growth mindset? So I think just these 2.
That's phenomenal. The growth mindset through the ups and the downs and all the challenges actually keeps one motivated towards moving towards the future. Uma, if I could have the same question to you, top 2 things from your side.
Let me take a slightly different perspective. So, learnings over the last couple of years, if I look at it from an organization's perspective, I think the first thing we learned is 2 years ago, March 24th, or whenever this happened, when we all went away, did we ever think that we could work 100% from home and everything got done? I think that's not something we believed in. So I think the learning has been that stuff works, but I think the learning is also that some things didn't work quite so well. I would probably put relationships at the top of what didn't work so well. I think We recognized that, we learned that, and I think our people missed the human connection, the human engagement, and I think people who had never been part of those connections before missed it even more. The hundreds and thousands of our colleagues who joined us during this period, I think missed it even more. So I think there's no replacement for that. We've learned that, and cognitive gyms, as we heard in the earlier sessions, probably a solution or one of the solutions. The second thing I think which we learned is that there are some things which work much better when you're actually in a room, bouncing off each other, bouncing ideas off, sort of building on each other, learning from each other. And I think we learned that there was probably no substitute to that. So I think those would be the two things that I would pick out from a different lens.
Yeah. And while I still have you on the mic, there are several learnings over the last few months, and the whole hybrid model, people coming into office, people going back because we have another wave of COVID. What's really been some of the hidden benefits of hybrid way of working? With the challenges, of course, that we have to manage, but top benefits that you saw with hybrid model coming into play?
So if I were to pick a few, there are many, and I'll pick a few. I think the one biggest thing it gave us was the fact that it gave independence and flexibility. It actually almost enabled us to understand what the colleagues of the future want. It's about how to keep that flexibility, but create some sociability and structure in the new hybrid working model. So I think it gave us independence, it gave us flexibility. The other thing I think it gave us, it kind of burst the barrier or the myth that you can only have talent in specific geographical areas. It actually opened up the geography quite significantly. It allowed us to think in different ways. It also gave us some insights into what new customer, employee and customer value propositions could be. And fundamentally, I think it also pushed the boundaries of how leaders will need to work in the new world. So I think there were lots of benefits. I also think there were some learnings on the downsides, which I talked about a little bit. And I think it would probably be best to say we're all navigating what's going to be the right outcome. And I think there's no one size fits all here.
Absolutely. One of the interesting points that you talked about, and something that we had, in the first survey that we had done, we had reached out to about 45 buyers and HQs, back in April of 2020, and saying, what's the one silver lining from this forced work from home? And the first point that came up as a silver lining was access to a wider talent pool. And you just touched upon that. And as we sort of drove down this wider talent pool, we talked about, there could be gig workers, there could be, and it came somehow to be linked to the overall ESG agenda as well, right, in terms of bringing in more diversity in workforce. And I'm glad to have both of you here. And Harita, your experience around diversity, has it really helped change the way you think about diversity and the work mix?
Absolutely, Nitin. And, if you look at the future of work, how we looked at it was, you cannot just look at work in isolation. You've got to look at it in the society context, look at it in the context of what the governments are doing, look at it in the context of the ESG mandate. And, when you look at work in the entire context, that's when your decisions are made, I would say, logically. Or sometimes we took tribal decisions as well, and a lot of those. But to your point on diversity, we found, and as Uma mentioned, that we had access to a workforce which earlier we didn't. So we had staggered shifts, so moms, who couldn't come back to work. So we actually, with our talent acquisition and HR teams, reached out to all the women who would actually quit because they couldn't commute to work, to be able to say, hey, you can now come back and do teleworking. We also figured that there is, there are new talent hubs. We today operate out of 250 tier 2 cities. Work at home, which earlier in India we were in 6 brick and mortar cities. Right? So I think it just opened up. So today we are at about 38% diverse talent. But the interesting thing is that when we did a survey and we asked the men and the women, would you like to come back to office? Guess what? We got a higher percentage from the women who said they want to come back. Of course, it was a difference of a 1%, but that's what they said. But yes, absolutely. It's yes. Given us a new world of operating in India for sure.
Thank you. And the other thing, again, going back, I can't think about the last 24 months and how they panned out and how some of the big questions actually changed for us. We did, I think, the first virtual roundtable with NASSCOM, GCC Council, sort of early part of the pandemic, where the whole discussion was how has everybody actually managed the lift and shift, providing infrastructure at home, using dongles for data, connectivity, working through lockdowns to actually get computers transported. Those were different kinds of challenges. And one of the things that everybody was saying is, this is April, July, we will have the freshers come in. The time that, July, August, September is when you onboard a lot of freshers. There's a huge amount of training that happens. One doesn't know how that will pan out, right? How will we actually do the recruitment, which is remote, train these people, onboard. And we've actually lived through that, right? And industry after that actually went through one of the highest number of hirings, across different kinds of, and I'm sure both of you have seen that, right? What's been the learning? It's in many ways the entire upfront part of people's supply chain, which is hire and then train, has got completely digitized. Is that what you call, a model that is now fairly established? Will we go back to how it used to happen? Is there something that we have learned? Uma, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, we clearly innovated how to hire and onboard colleagues, right? Because work didn't stop. In fact, it accelerated. We had to get more people on board. We learned along the way. So I think it's given us, again, we'll probably land up with a hybrid version of hire and onboard. And the reason I'm saying this is that the process of hiring and onboarding, as much as we can digitize it, has actually helped. It's accelerated timelines. It's allowed us to actually get people, access to a bigger number of people for assessment, et cetera, et cetera. It's also helped us work around some of the earlier poor processes, right? A lot of paperwork, which many companies might have had, which we might have never looked at it to say, okay, can we make this better? So it's actually helped a lot in many of those areas. I think the one thing that we did, and particularly in a GCC context, we do have some global requirements in terms of the minimum training we put people through, the minimum if we take our values, our whatever that we need people to go through, which we did completely digitally. While it's great, I'll go back to my first answer to your first question. Particular people who come on board and who are new genuinely don't get a feel of the organization's culture and leaders and what it means, until you actually have some engagement with leadership at all levels, whether it's their immediate line manager, whether it's their senior leaders. I say this story and I laugh a little bit. There were many people who joined during the pandemic, and all of the engagements was on the virtual screen. And one day I met somebody at the airport who was talking to a friend of mine. We were traveling together. And this gentleman spoke to me, and then he said, "Don't you recognize me? I'm so-and-so." I said, "Oh my God, you do look different in person. We should go and have a coffee together." You don't want those situations, right? And we also think that when people get onboarded, they are able to work much more effectively virtually if they've built a relationship. And that's something that we're seeing. Where we work more effectively is where we've known people before from teams we worked in before. And that connect is something that I think we absolutely should not lose, particularly in the early part of a colleague's onboarding journey with the organization. I think it's pretty fundamental to build culture. So yeah, hopefully the digitization would have fast-tracked the processes, but I hope the digitization doesn't slow-track the relationship building.
Yeah. And the value of human interaction, we've all realized how important it is. There was a time when we all used to feel good about a couple of days or an odd day working remotely balances things out, but then when put in a position of doing all 5 days work from home, it really threw up new challenges. Harita, when we were talking yesterday, you talked about this whole end-to-end digitization of people's supply chain, and in your context, especially being in the sort of customer service BPO kind of a space with several clients, different setups. How has that model evolved for you? Has it brought in a lot more efficiency, predictability? Has it, is it still continuing to be a challenge?
So, if I said we've solved it all, I don't think I'd be saying. So it's a journey, Nitin.
Yeah.
But I'm glad, one of the benefits that COVID and the post-COVID era has had is that we've really, and to Abe's point earlier, evolved. I'm not going to use the word transform. Yeah? So we were always using the word transform, but yes, we've really evolved. And I think in the last 3 years as a company, what we've changed on digital platforms, keeping again the employee and the customer at the heart. So we said, what does an employee or a candidate, somebody who wants to work for Sutherland, really need? And we fast-tracked that. Now, at the core of that digitization was knowledge. And we had never had a knowledge management system in the company. We actually created in the last 2 years, and if anybody is interested, I'm really happy to set up a demo. But it's one of the platforms we're really proud of. We actually brought together all the tacit knowledge, because when you're in the office, I can walk across to you and check something. We brought it, we curated it. We have a knowledge management team now, which actually now has rolled that out. And India took the best practice. So we started in India, and we've rolled it the world over. So I think it's been a boon. We've digitalized, and even if we come back to, let's say, a 100% brick and mortar, for argument's sake, the digital interventions are here to stay. And I think that's been the biggest blessing for us.
And changing gears around, just taking on, we've talked about engagement, affiliation. One of the things that I've picked up, through surveys, as well as a lot more anecdotally, is the front line of the organization, which is the 0 to 4 years experience, people are the most open to getting to a hybrid model. It's the managerial layers and the leadership which is resisting this change, right? And I'm not saying, not trying to do a class divide here of any sorts, but in many ways, that's the kind of sentiment that we have all picked up. I'm sure there are exceptions to all of this, but the younger workforce, especially people who have actually joined workforce now, who had the experience of studying remotely for 2 years, are actually thinking if you could finish your undergrad degree in 2 years without actually going to college, why do I now need to sit in office to actually show that I'm productive and I'm actually delivering value, right? So from that generation to somebody who's actually lived through pandemic, having actually gotten trained for the first 2 years, working 2 years remotely, and now being back. There are questions, and that's where we are seeing a bit of a disconnect and dissatisfaction as well. What, in your mind, do the leaders need to do differently? How do they need to think differently? Is there something that you're seeing in your organization, you're experimenting, which will make sure that from a managerial level up, you are creating a greater acceptance and almost an environment of problem solving? And I know there are parts of the work and parts of interaction where the in-person engagement is extremely important. But how do we balance it out? At what level do you actually leave it to managers to decide how the team should run? At what level is it almost an organization policy? And if you want to go first on this one.
So I think one of the things we've recognized is that hybrid working doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. It means different things to different people, even within the organization. And that's quite tricky. It's quite dependent on the role, on the size of team, the kind of work they do. So I think one of the things that we have worked through is to be able to understand that and actually allow our leads to make those decisions around the requirement of hybrid working for those teams, what works for those teams, and the leader is able to actually create the right level of engagement and time that they need together. I think what that is helping, and this is the feedback to Nitin's earlier point, is that the leaders are empowered and the teams feel that they're a bit closer to the, i.e. somebody's not sending you a little memo saying come to office on Mondays and Wednesdays, right? So that's not happening. So I think that's an approach that we are certainly looking at, and we've just started on that journey. We hope we'll learn from it. The second thing as leaders, I think it's so critical to keep learning every day and listening every day. And what we've done over the last 2 years, and this has been quite consistent, every quarter we've actually gone out and asked colleagues how they're feeling in a fairly detailed way, you know, whether they're positive about work, whether they feel we're in it together, a whole bunch of things to help understand what they feel, and more importantly, what we can learn as leadership to evolve to the next, or iterate to the next version of how we can make this work. And I think the third thing for leaders is fundamentally, in this new world of distributed working, of once in a while FaceTime, how do we make the time together count, and how do we build that culture? And I think that's something that we're really, really thinking through, i.e. when we get people in, what do we do? Do we socialize? I think it's a very good thing to do, because that's when you make those connections. Do you use it for project time? Do you use it for ideation time? What do you use it for? How do colleagues feel that they are actually getting learning out of coming in and physically being in a space with other people? And I think the leaders have a real, it's not just leaders, everybody has a real challenge, but leaders more so, in terms of how to actually bring this framework together and make it valuable. Again, we're learning every day, we're asking, and we're iterating.
Yeah. Last question, and in the meantime,
Nitin, can I just add a perspective to
please.
that? So I think one of the things we found from a leadership perspective was using the word empathy. You know, in our industry, we didn't really use too much of it. It was a factory model, and you heard earlier, right? People were brought in camps, we came to office, we delivered, and we went home. Now, I think my hardest challenge was to start using the word empathy, and nobody really related to it initially when I started. Because, you know, why did you need... And I think that was the game changer, to get our leadership to understand that if you start with empathy, and the number of initiatives we took with that at the core, I think was a huge change management for the leadership.
Yeah. No, I think it's, sorry.
Yeah,
Yes, of course. This is quite a passionate topic.
So I talked about the feedback we took from colleagues. And to Harita's point, that was the one thing that we got very positive feedback on, right from, I don't know, 2 years now almost, to say, you guys really care, right? The kind of things. Clearly, we had a set of values and a vision. We were also globally aligned, being a GCC, in terms of what we did and how we did. But this was a very, very important piece of feedback, saying you care, you worry about us, not just the output that you do. And what we did, what that helped us do as leaders, actually accelerate that when we went through the second wave, which was the hardest time that we went through. So I think it's a really important point.
Yeah. No, it's been at the forefront, and maybe I remember it wrong, but I think Barclays was the one which globally started this reverse mentorship program, which is juniors actually be assigned as mentors to their superiors, which essentially, and having a monthly check-in, which created a culture where you could have open, upward feedback, right? And as consultants, obviously, we put framework to everything. So we also created a new framework around it, which was called Leadership with heart, head, and hands. And saying heart and hands are as important as head. Leaders shouldn't just think that they are the head making decision. They have to be seen hands-on. They have to have their heart, which is empathy. And yes, obviously the head, we complicate stuff, as you know. But with that, I have one last question, but if there's anything from the audience, we'll pick it up. Yes, please.
My question is to Harita. You mentioned about that, your woman professional want to come back. I think you mentioned about that, okay? So what was the reason for them to come back? So how did you really manage it?
Yes, so while the percentage was low, but yet, while the percentage of women who wanted to come back, from the men was maybe 1 or 2% higher, but I think women, in the home, it's been hard for them to distinguish between the home and the office. And so hybrid, is it truly hybrid? It's not, because I think there are no clear lines. Whereas once they're away in the office and the kids are in a creche or in the school, I think they're absolutely able to focus. And culturally, as a country, and socially, we've got to really evolve. From a family mindset as to if a woman is at home, what should her priorities be? I think that was the biggest challenge.
Okay.
Yep. We have a question there. Okay.
Sorry. Hi, my name is Rukmini. I heard a plus point of women diversity being increasing, which is a good change for the COVID post-pandemic. I, as a parent, I see there is a good, quick change for children to get back to school. Now, the schools have opened up. We see complete transportation is up. The kids are back to school full 8 hours. So why is it a challenge for an adult? And there is a lot of R&D done, hybrid, a definition of hybrid, a trial. I feel that too much of pampering is being done for an adult, but whereas a child is able to quickly adapt this change, a child has also gone through the pandemic. So I think the corporate has to get back.
That's, I don't know if that's a question or a statement, very interesting perspective, but from a comment perspective, and...
So I'll just add on, so luckily we both belong to the same industry, real estate. We make offices. I make offices and she supplies, ingredients to that offices. Yes, that's a question. Real estate was hit badly. We have seen the worst in last 2 years. We have seen the best in the best of companies throwing people without thinking of. I've worked with global companies as well. Now I'm on my own. That's a question to add on, that yes, corporate has to be more responsible now to get people out. And in fact, I keep pushing my husband, who works with a global giant, IT giant, and I said, why don't you go to office? At least go 2 days.
No. We're finding all the inside stories now.
So that's one, that's a message. That's one thing. Second thing, I started my career with GCC. I was a customer executive, support executive with a GCC, and I saw that pressure that, A plus B plus C, the system with SLAs in place and all. So when you talk about human touch, and of course, that's 20 years back I'm talking about, and I feel when you have SLAs in place, how that human touch stays still with the fact on the delivery standpoint, because you both come from a GCC, Sutherland. I have a close association. My husband was there with it, and I know the culture of Sutherland for that matter. You are from Barclays. So how that entire SLA plus the cultural imbibedness, which you're talking about, the human factor, still works when you have your pressures on the deliverable.
So look, I think delivery is delivery, and one of the things we talked about trust, I can say in the last 2 years, we really did not miss any SLAs at all, right? Having said that, what I think, I've been now with Barclays for 7 years, and I have consistently seen the empathy, the people focus and genuine inclusion and diversity. We have, I think, more than 7 or 8 resource groups, whether it's gender diversity, whether it's well-being. Well-being has been a big, big part of the last 2 years. In fact, and we're quite flexible. So I think as a culture, and I don't know when it started, like I said, I've seen it for 7 years. It's gotten better during the pandemic. And some of the things that we actually reached out and did to put our people first. I think that was what was most important. The culture and mindset is something that clearly has to go through the organization. And I believe it is possible to make the delivery. You can't drop delivery, it has to happen, right? I mean, we all know that. But you can have both. There are times when you actually make decisions or you have a certain perspective for certain individuals if they're going through a difficult time, or overall well-being. I mean, we've done many, many things which says that well-being is really important to us, including the way we work internally, right? So for example, there's no expectation that you have to actually work on a weekend. Some of these things are quite obvious. That's very basic. But I think more importantly, that's more positive input, i.e. we make sure that we have enough resources and input for people to genuinely have well-being as part of how they live and work. Many, many ways, including sabbaticals if people want to take flexible. We even have in the UK, we have job sharing. There's many, many options that we actually offer. But it's fundamental, and I've seen that grow. And I hope it grows and continues to grow, particularly in the post-COVID world.
Okay. We are totally, I come from a company called SmartWorks. We completely sold on the hybrid work front, so we are building software for that. But 2 questions I would love to have it answered, right? Like one is, we have seen clear trends that people want more social life, right? How much of this hybrid or like work from home is sustainable? Do people have the mental capacity to like, build a social life outside of work as well as healthy one? As well as can they really disconnect from the problems at home and focus on work going into next 5 to 10 years? That's one question. Second question is, how do you stop people from taking 2 jobs when working remote?
Please.
So I'll answer your first one, about social. What was happening is that, in the era of 100% brick and mortar, at least I find with my teams, there was very little time for them to do stuff outside of work. So they would come to work, and then, get home. Now with the save in the commute time and the fact that they are staying in, 200, 300, 400 Indian cities, they're with parents, they're with family. I don't know if you've noticed, but those of you who probably go to Ooty and Kunur, closer from Chennai, or, in the north if you go up, the number of tourists in India has probably gone up multifold. And why is that? Because as people, we've realized that there's work and there's play. And, so people as human beings will find their social needs fulfilled. So I think you've got to let the hybrid workplace settle down for that to happen.
Yeah. And if I can take an attempt on the second one, this is my personal point of view, not BCG, but if you look at gig, right, gig economy is here to stay, is going to grow. And if the example that you took, or the question was, how do you stop people or prevent people from taking 2 jobs? Gig is exactly the opposite of that, which is to say, how do you get people to work across different assignments, right? And that's where we will evolve. And the reason is actually deeply rooted in economics, right? Fundamentally, growth is driven by increasing factor productivity. Human capital is one of the most important factors. Actually, real estate is another factor. As a service provider, one looks at seat utilization, right? As human capital, you would look at how do you get more productivity out of the same individual. And not in near future, but I think overall we will evolve to a model where we have much greater factor productivity for human capital, and that will be enabled either through gig or people formally working across 2 roles, right? Or multiple jobs within the same company. That's how it will eventually evolve. I'm not, it's a bit farther away, but economics will actually take us there. One last question, I think we are at time.
I don't know if it's working. Okay. Hey, good morning to the esteemed panel. Myself, Saurav from Nomura, similar industry. So banks, as usual, is the most regulated amongst all. So while we sailed through this era because of the trust and the emotional quotient we had built in the past, what I also see that, and this is a experience and views I seek from the panel, is that while we talk about trust between the employer and the team members internally, but we also have stakeholders like regulators and our clients sitting not just in the geography of India, but beyond various jurisdictions and geographies. If each talk in their own language and their own demands, what are the challenges you foresee we will have to deal with?
So I think, the word business at the speed of trust has become very relevant. And what does it mean? It means that with your customer sitting miles away, let's say in the US, where a lot of my customers are, you have to make sure that your communication, your processes, and whatever you've done in terms of digital to give them the comfort that their data is secure, their PHI is secure, the PII is secure, is absolutely on track. And as a company, what we've done is we've built tools which could actually, and one can argue the social context saying, is it right to have an individual sitting at home working on a banking application? There is a camera which actually then records, is there anybody around him? Does he or she have a mobile next to him? And all of those things. And then even masks the data that the individual is able to see. Unless you do this, there is no way India as a country, we can get more outsourced work in secure environments or secure projects. So I think it is something we need to do. And I said, is it socially right or wrong? I don't think we can argue that.
With that, I know there are many more questions. We will try and take them on the sidelines. I hope our panelists are going to be around for a bit, so you can catch them on the coffee break. Thank you very much, Harita, Uma, for taking the time and sharing your thoughts. On behalf of NASSCOM, a big, big thank you, and to the audience for the great participation.
Thank you.
On that note, we'd also like to thank Nitin and our panelists, Uma and Harita, for that engaging leaders discussion.